5 daughters born into America's closest thing to royalty. From the outside, the Kennedy family looked untouchable: wealth, power, prestige, and a future written in history. But behind the gates of Hyannisport, another story was unfolding. One daughter vanished from public view for decades. Another died chasing love against her family's wishes. And the rest spent their lives carrying secrets that would redefine what the Kennedy legacy truly meant. This is not the story of the famous Kennedy men. This is the story of the sisters history almost forgot. The Golden Family. If America had a royal family, the Kennedys would have been the closest thing to it. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, looked like a scene pulled from a dream. Children raced across endless lawns overlooking the Atlantic. Sailboats drifted through the harbor. Laughter echoed through grand summer evenings as one of the nation's most admired families seemed to be building a future destined for greatness. At the center of that world stood Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man whose ambition appeared to have no ceiling. A self-made millionaire banker, investor, businessman, and eventually ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph wasn't simply creating wealth. He was building a dynasty. Beside him was Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, daughter of Boston political royalty. Elegant, disciplined, and deeply devoted to her Catholic faith, Rose believed that appearances mattered. In her world, strength was admired, weakness was hidden, and family reputation was sacred. Together, they raised 9 children. From the outside, it looked perfect, too perfect. Because behind every carefully staged family photograph was a silent competition unfolding every single day. Winning wasn't encouraged in the Kennedy household. It was expected. At dinner, conversations became debates. Achievements became currency. Every child learned that excellence earned attention, while failure often disappeared into the shadows. Joseph challenged his sons to become leaders, presidents, men who could shape history itself. His daughters faced a different challenge. They were expected to be intelligent, but never intimidating, accomplished, but never dominant, charming enough to impress the world, yet careful enough not to overshadow the men around them. And somehow each of the Kennedy sisters found her own way to navigate those impossible expectations. There was Kathleen, whose laughter could light up an entire room. Eunice, whose determination would one day change millions of lives. Patricia, drawn toward the glamour of Hollywood. Jean, the youngest, quietly observing everything around her. And then there was Rosemary, the first Kennedy daughter, the one who should have shared the same dazzling future as her brothers and sisters. But from the very beginning, something seemed different. At first, the differences were small, easy to overlook, easy to explain away. A delayed milestone, a slower response, a struggle no one wanted to name. The family believed time would solve it, money would solve it, education would solve it. But as the years passed, a painful reality began to emerge. And hidden beneath the shining image of America's golden family was a secret that would eventually become one of the most heartbreaking stories in modern history. A secret that would change the lives of all 5 Kennedy sisters forever. Rosemary's disappearance. For years, the Kennedy family worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of perfection. From the outside, they appeared unstoppable, wealthy, influential, blessed with beauty, intelligence, and opportunity. But every dynasty has a secret, and the Kennedy family's most painful secret had a name: Rosemary Kennedy. At first, nobody believed there was anything seriously wrong. As a child, Rosemary smiled easily, loved music, enjoyed dancing, and adored being surrounded by her brothers and sisters. Yet, as the years passed, subtle differences began to emerge. She learned more slowly than the other Kennedy children. School became a constant struggle. Conversations that came naturally to her siblings often felt difficult and frustrating for her. Rose Kennedy searched desperately for answers. Special tutors were hired. Doctors were consulted. Expensive schools were explored. Every possible resource was thrown at the problem. Because in the Kennedy household, failure was never accepted. Every obstacle was something to be conquered. But Rosemary wasn't a problem to solve. She was a young woman trying to find her place in a family racing toward greatness. Ironically, some of her happiest years came thousands of miles from home. When Joseph Kennedy became ambassador to Great Britain in 1938, Rosemary accompanied the family to London. There, something remarkable happened. Away from the intense pressure of American society, she began to thrive. At a convent school that understood her needs, she found structure, patience, and acceptance. For perhaps the first time in her life, she wasn't being measured against her brilliant siblings. She was simply allowed to be Rosemary. She attended dances, made friends, participated in social events, and even appeared before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace alongside her mother and sister Kathleen. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the future might still hold happiness. But happiness has a way of frightening people who are obsessed with control. When World War II forced the Kennedys back to America, everything changed. Rosemary was now a young woman. Like any young woman, she wanted freedom. She wanted independence. She wanted the chance to live her own life. But Joseph Kennedy saw something different. He saw risk. He worried about scandals. He worried about public embarrassment. Most of all, he worried that anything involving Rosemary could threaten the political future he envisioned for his sons. And so behind closed doors, a decision was made. A decision so shocking that even decades later, historians still struggle to understand how a father could justify it. In 1941, without consulting Rosemary, without informing most of the family, Joseph Kennedy approved an experimental brain procedure known as a lobotomy. Doctors promised it would calm her emotions, control her behavior, make her easier to manage. Instead, it destroyed her life. The vibrant young woman who loved dancing and laughter never returned. And what happened next would become one of the most heartbreaking betrayals in American family history. The sister who vanished. The operation lasted only a few hours. The consequences lasted a lifetime. When Rosemary Kennedy emerged from the lobotomy in late 1941, the procedure that had been sold as a solution had become a catastrophe. The young woman who had once danced at parties, laughed with her sisters, and dreamed of independence could no longer live on her own. She struggled to walk. She struggled to speak. Even the simplest tasks became difficult. The very thing Joseph Kennedy had hoped to control had instead been erased. Yet what happened next may have been even more devastating than the surgery itself. Rather than publicly acknowledge the mistake, the family chose silence. Rosemary disappeared. Not metaphorically, literally. She was sent more than 500 miles away to a Catholic institution in Wisconsin, hidden from reporters, hidden from society, in many ways hidden from her own family. A private cottage was built for her on the grounds. Nuns and caretakers oversaw her daily life. And while America watched the Kennedy family rise toward political greatness, Rosemary lived in near-total isolation. For years, few people knew where she was. Fewer still knew what had happened. Joseph instructed family members not to ask questions, not to discuss Rosemary, not to visit. The subject itself became forbidden. Imagine that for a moment. One day you are part of the most famous family in America. The next you are gone. No explanations, no public acknowledgement. No voice, no choice. History often remembers the Kennedy family as a symbol of ambition and achievement. But Rosemary's story forces a far more uncomfortable question. What happens when a family becomes so obsessed with protecting its image that it begins sacrificing the people who don't fit the image? For nearly 2 decades, Rosemary lived behind institutional walls, while her brothers and sisters built extraordinary lives. John Kennedy became a war hero and rising political star. Robert entered public service. Ted prepared for a future in politics. The Kennedy name grew larger with every passing year. Meanwhile, Rosemary remained frozen in time, waiting, forgotten by the world, and in many ways forgotten by the family that claimed to love her. The tragedy was not only what the lobotomy took from Rosemary, it was what the silence took from everyone else. Because secrets have a way of surviving long after the people who create them. Years later, when Joseph Kennedy suffered a debilitating stroke and his control over the family weakened, the truth slowly began to emerge. The siblings learned details they had never fully understood. What they discovered horrified them. Their sister had not left to teach at a school. She had not chosen a quiet life away from public attention. She had been abandoned. And with that realization came something impossible to escape. Guilt. A guilt that would follow the Kennedy sisters for the rest of their lives. But unlike their father, they would not spend decades hiding from that truth. Instead, some of them would devote their lives to making sure the Rosemary's suffering meant something, to making sure other families never repeated the same mistake. And among them, one sister would carry that mission further than anyone could have imagined. Her name was Eunice Kennedy. Kick's Rebellion. While Rosemary disappeared behind the walls of an institution in Wisconsin, another Kennedy sister was fighting a very different battle. Her prison wasn't built from brick and stone. It was built from expectations. Her name was Kathleen Kennedy, but everyone called her Kick. And unlike Rosemary, Kick was impossible to overlook. She was vibrant, witty, fearless. The kind of person who could walk into a room full of aristocrats and somehow make them laugh at themselves. During the Kennedy years in London, British society fell in love with her almost instantly. She wasn't supposed to fit in. Yet somehow she became one of the most beloved young Americans in England. But beneath the laughter and charm was something far more dangerous: independence. And independence had never been a trait the Kennedy family fully embraced in its daughters, especially when it challenged tradition, especially when it challenged Rose Kennedy. The conflict began with love. While living in England, Kick met William Cavendish, heir to one of Britain's most powerful aristocratic families. Their connection was immediate, genuine. The kind of love story that seemed destined for novels rather than real life. There was only one problem. Billy was Protestant. For many families, that might have been a hurdle. For the Kennedys, it was a crisis. Rose Kennedy viewed the relationship as a direct challenge to everything she believed. A Catholic daughter marrying outside the faith was more than disappointing. It was unacceptable. The pressure became relentless. Letters, arguments, warnings, emotional ultimatums. Kick was forced into an impossible choice: the family she loved, or the man she loved. And for the first time in her life, she chose herself. In 1944, Kathleen Kennedy married William Cavendish in London, despite her parents' refusal to attend. Only her brother Joe Jr. stood beside her. For a brief moment, victory seemed hers. She had followed her heart. She had claimed her own future. But fate had other plans. Just weeks after their wedding, Billy was sent to the front lines of World War II. 4 months later, he was dead. A German sniper ended the life she had fought so hard to build. At 24 years old, Kik became a widow. As if that loss weren't enough, tragedy struck again. Her beloved brother, Joe Jr., the sibling who had supported her when almost no one else would, was killed during a dangerous military mission. Within months, 2 of the people she loved most were gone. Yet somehow, Kik kept moving forward. Perhaps because she understood something the rest of her family never fully accepted. Life is fragile, and happiness is never guaranteed. So when love found her again a few years later, she refused to run from it. But once again, the man she loved came with complications. And once again, her mother's disapproval loomed over every decision. What followed would become the final chapter of Kathleen Kennedy's extraordinary life. A chapter that would end not with reconciliation, but with a storm over the French countryside, a shattered airplane, and a tragedy that would leave one more empty seat at the Kennedy family table. Because for Kik Kennedy, the price of freedom would prove heartbreakingly high. A storm over France. By 1948, Kathleen Kennedy had already lived through more heartbreak than most people experience in a lifetime. She had buried a husband. She had buried a brother. She had endured the judgment of her family and the cold silence of a mother who never truly accepted the choices she made. And yet somehow she still believed in love. That may have been Kathleen's greatest strength, or her greatest vulnerability. After years of grief, she met a man named Peter Fitzwilliam. He was charming, adventurous, impossibly wealthy, and unlike anyone she had known before. Around him, the darkness that had followed her since Billy's death seemed to lift, if only for a moment. For the first time in years, Kathleen allowed herself to imagine a future again. But history has a cruel habit of repeating itself. Peter came with complications. He was still married. Although separated and moving toward divorce, his relationship with Kathleen immediately ignited another firestorm. Once again, Rose Kennedy was horrified. Once again, letters arrived filled with warnings and condemnation. Once again, Kathleen found herself standing on opposite sides of a battlefield from her own family. The difference was that this time she was no longer the hopeful young woman who had once sought her mother's approval. Years of loss had changed her. She understood how quickly life could disappear, how fragile happiness truly was, and she had no intention of surrendering it. Yet despite her growing independence, there was still one person whose blessing mattered: her father, Joseph Kennedy, the architect of the family dynasty, the man whose approval had shaped every Kennedy child's life. When Kathleen learned that Joseph would be traveling to Paris in May of 1948, she saw an opportunity. Perhaps they could finally talk. Perhaps he would understand. Perhaps the years of conflict could finally come to an end. It was a hopeful thought, and hope can be dangerous. On May 13th, Kathleen and Peter boarded a small aircraft outside Paris. Their destination was the French Riviera. The flight was supposed to be routine. Instead, it became one of the most tragic moments in Kennedy family history. As the plane crossed central France, it entered a violent storm. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Visibility vanished. Turbulence shook the aircraft relentlessly. For nearly 20 minutes, the pilots battled conditions they could barely navigate. Then, disaster struck. Disoriented and trapped inside the storm, the aircraft entered a steep descent. The pilots fought desperately to regain control. They never got the chance. The plane broke apart in midair. Pieces scattered across the French countryside before crashing into a remote ravine. There were no survivors. Kathleen Kennedy was 28 years old. In a family haunted by tragedy, her death felt almost unreal. A young woman who had spent her life fighting for the right to choose her own path had vanished in an instant. And perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of all was this: she had been flying to seek understanding, to reconcile, to heal old wounds. She never got the opportunity. At her funeral in England, Joseph Kennedy attended. Rose Kennedy did not. Even in death, the distance between mother and daughter remained. The reconciliation Kathleen had longed for never came. Yet years later, those who knew her best remembered something far greater than the controversy surrounding her life. They remembered her laughter, her courage, her refusal to live according to someone else's expectations. And as one Kennedy sister lay hidden away in Wisconsin, and another rested beneath English soil, the surviving sisters were beginning to understand a painful truth. The greatest battles in their family had never been political. They had always been personal. The sister who refused to look away. By the early 1950s, the Kennedy family had become a symbol of American success. The public saw glamour, power, political influence, a dynasty ascending toward history. But behind that image, the family was carrying wounds that never truly healed. One sister had vanished into institutional isolation. Another had been buried in England after a life cut tragically short. And among those left behind, one woman found herself unable to stop asking a painful question. What if Rosemary had never been given a chance? Her name was Eunice Kennedy. Unlike Kathleen, who challenged her family through rebellion, Eunice would challenge them through action. Quietly, relentlessly, and eventually on a scale no one could have imagined. As the years passed, Eunice learned more about what had happened to Rosemary. Not the sanitized version told to outsiders, not the carefully constructed family narrative. The truth. A truth filled with regret. When she finally saw her sister again, the reality was impossible to ignore. Rosemary could no longer live the life she once dreamed about. The young woman who had attended dances and royal receptions was gone. In her place stood someone forever changed by a decision she never made for herself. For many people, such a realization might have led to anger or despair. For Eunice, it became a mission, because the more she learned, the more she realized Rosemary's story was not unique. Across America, thousands of people with intellectual disabilities were hidden away from society. Many lived in institutions. Many received little education. Many were treated as burdens rather than human beings. They were rarely seen, rarely heard, rarely given the opportunity to prove what they were capable of. To Eunice, that felt hauntingly familiar. It looked too much like Rosemary. And so she decided to do something radical. Instead of focusing on limitations, she would focus on potential. Instead of asking what people couldn't do, she would ask what they could. In the summer of 1962, at her Maryland home, she opened a small camp for children and adults with intellectual disabilities. There were no grand speeches, no media spectacle, just a simple idea. Give people a chance. What happened next surprised everyone. The participants ran races, played sports, built confidence, formed friendships, and achieved things society had long assumed were impossible. Eunice began to understand something profound. The greatest obstacle these individuals faced wasn't disability, it was low expectations. The world had already decided who they were before giving them an opportunity to show who they could become. And that realization would eventually grow into something much larger than a summer camp, much larger than a charity, much larger than the Kennedy family itself. Because from the pain of one forgotten sister, a global movement was about to emerge. A movement that would reach millions of lives across continents and generations. And in a twist, history rarely offers, the daughter once hidden from the world would become the inspiration for one of the most powerful humanitarian legacies of the 20th century. Rosemary Kennedy had been silenced. But through Eunice, her story was finally beginning to speak. Turning pain into purpose. For most families, tragedy leaves scars. For the Kennedys, tragedy seemed to arrive in waves. A lost sister, a fallen brother, an airplane crash, assassinations. Public triumphs followed by private heartbreak. And yet something remarkable was beginning to happen. The surviving Kennedy sisters were no longer running from the family's darkest chapter. They were transforming it. As Eunice's small summer camp continued to grow, she became increasingly convinced that society had been wrong for generations. The world had spent decades defining people with intellectual disabilities by what they lacked. Eunice wanted to show the world what they possessed: determination, talent, courage, potential. In 1968, that vision exploded onto the international stage. At Chicago's Soldier Field, nearly 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities gathered for an event unlike anything the world had ever seen. The first Special Olympics. To many observers, it looked like a sporting competition. But in reality, it was something much bigger. It was a declaration. A challenge to every assumption society had made. For decades, individuals like Rosemary had been hidden from public view. Now they were stepping into stadiums filled with cheering crowds. Not as objects of pity, not as patients, not as burdens, but as athletes, competitors, champions. As Eunice stood watching the opening ceremonies unfold, it was impossible not to see the deeper meaning behind the moment. This movement had not begun in a boardroom. It had begun with a sister whose life had been altered forever by fear, stigma, and silence. Perhaps that is why the Special Olympics oath resonated so deeply: let me win. But if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt. Those words weren't only about sports. They were about dignity, about courage, about every person who had ever been told they were less than everyone else. And while Eunice was changing lives through athletics, another Kennedy sister was carrying the mission into a different world. Jean Kennedy Smith had spent years watching her family endure unimaginable loss. Like Eunice, she understood that Rosemary's story contained a lesson America still needed to learn. People with disabilities deserved more than care. They deserved opportunity, expression, visibility. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: the person who inspired that transformation never held public office, never gave a campaign speech, never stood behind a presidential podium. Rosemary Kennedy spent most of her life far from the spotlight. Yet her influence reached farther than anyone could have imagined. Because sometimes the people history remembers least end up changing history the most. And as the years passed, the sisters who remained would finally begin to understand that Rosemary was never the family's shameful secret. She was its most important lesson. The legacy they left behind. While Eunice was changing the world through the Special Olympics, her sisters were finding their own ways to carry the weight of the family's past. Patricia Kennedy chose a quieter path. Unlike her politically ambitious brothers, she was drawn to the arts and entertainment. Her marriage to actor Peter Lawford brought her into the glamorous world of Hollywood, where movie stars, musicians, and politicians often shared the same room. Yet behind the celebrity lifestyle, Patricia struggled through a difficult marriage and eventual divorce. Rather than remaining in the spotlight, she devoted much of her later life to promoting literacy education and the arts. Jean Kennedy Smith followed a different calling. Like Eunice, she never forgot Rosemary. She believed people with disabilities deserved not only care and opportunity, but also a voice. Through an organization called Very Special Arts, she helped millions of people around the world discover creativity through music, theater, painting, and self-expression. Later, as United States Ambassador to Ireland, she continued a lifetime of public service that reflected the best ideals of the Kennedy name. By the time the sisters reached their later years, the family had endured more tragedy than almost any American dynasty in modern history. Rosemary had spent decades living with the consequences of a decision she never chose. Kik had died young, still searching for acceptance. Patricia carried the scars of a life lived under constant public attention. Jean and Eunice dedicated themselves to helping those society often overlooked. Yet perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: the Kennedy sister, who was hidden from the world, ultimately changed the world the most. Rosemary never held public office. She never delivered famous speeches. She never became a household name.